Some of the big theoretical frameworks that are at the heart of this are disability justice, which is a framework that looks at ableism as integral to other interlocking systems of oppression, such as cis heteropatriarchy, white supremacy, settler colonialism, and capitalism. It was coined by a community of disabled Black and Brown, queer and trans organizers and scholars in the early 2000s, and is used in scholarship and also activist and movement spaces as different ways of looking at time and sustainable organizing and relationships. The second big methodology and the second big framework is critical university studies, which analyzes the university as a white supremacist site of stolen resources that must be abolished. My thesis takes disability justice frameworks and ways of looking at time and relationships and puts them in the university context, combining these two frameworks to theorize student activist burnout as a whole and different ways of thinking about burnout. The methodologies that I've used in my thesis are autoethnography. Last semester, I made a whole YouTube channel about my experiences as a way of theorizing about burnout in general. And I did things like memory mapping, building timelines, and interviews with my friends, Raven Hudson and Jalen Taylor. This semester, I worked on oral history interviews with 3 different queer and trans disabled Asian American disability justice scholars / activists. Their names are Noor Pervez, Lydia X.E. Brown, and Mel Chen. All of those interviews are going to be up later this semester. And then this workshop is also part of that. So to kind of dive into some of the major points that have come out of my thesis, the biggest underlying foundational principle is looking at burnout as a collective and inevitable thing. A lot of times when we think about burnout in activist spaces, or even as a colloquial term, it's thought of as this thing that is connected to individual perceptions of boundaries and overworking yourself. And that can be like, and that is something that people should be scared of. And there's a lot of talk about like self-care regimens for dealing with burnout that I think have been increasingly popular as we live in a pandemic. But my biggest point is that burnout is not something that I think that burnout is not something that you can run from necessarily. It is a collective and inevitable process and experience, especially as marginalized people living under systems of capitalism, white supremacy, cis heteropatriarchy, and settler colonialism, and also existing within institutions such as universities. We will not be able to self-care our way out of burnout, but part of all of this is that leaning on our communities and being interdependent and using these disability justice principles can help us move through burnout and continue to exist, because I don't really believe that we're ever going to be not burnt out, because we're never going to not be marginalized people living under these systems of oppression. Especially within the student activist mindset, and specifically looking at universities, they are disabling institutions, both through their emphasis on urgency, as well as this academic culture of productivity and this pressure to think about, to be disembodied, to disconnect the experience of embodiment from scholarly pursuits, which often focus on the brain, which leads to this kind of disconnect between the mind-body connection and increases the disabling impacts of the university. Some more major points are that I really want to be intentional about how the only way to really move through burnout and through this burnout culture that we see in activist and institutional spaces are through reorienting movement spaces around those who are most marginalized. So beginning to actually incorporate DJ principles such as crip time or the tire method, which are both ways of extending how much time people have to do specific projects because people aren't able to do them on a strict timeline, as well as building in a structure for tapping in and tapping out so that when people are at capacity, there's a way for them to communicate their boundaries and they're able to take a break and then have some time off and then come back in so that people don't burn out to the point of not being able to keep going. If we actually incorporate these principles, we will create a movement that is more sustainable, even for neurotypical able-bodied people. And we will kind of, I think, disrupt this very colonial productivity culture that exists in these spaces still. And then lastly, something that's really core to all of my conversations around burnout is that a lot of it is connected to boundaries, and the ways in which knowing your boundaries and honoring them is something that's often overlooked in academic and activist spaces until you are physically unable to overlook it anymore. That is basically what happened to me. I have continued to overlook my boundaries until I was physically forced to stop and rethink how I approach movement spaces. And that has kind of led to all of this. So why a workshop? Why not a paper or more videos on a channel? I'm really interested in communal theorizing and communal knowledge making. I think there's something really important in the power of communal naming, specifically in this context, naming our burnout and our experiences so that we can better look into ways of like living with burnout and disrupting patterns of productivity and urgency that exist within activist and academic spaces. I'm really interested in privileging communal knowledge making because I definitely don't have all of the answers. And the biggest thing that keeps coming up in my conversations with scholars, in my conversations with my friends, and in my readings is that the only way through any of this is by leaning on each other and by embracing the concept of interdependence, which is really just about how none of us can survive in this world by ourselves and instead must lean into the fact that we lean on each other. I've had to embrace interdependence through having my friends make food for me and drive me places and help me with laundry and things like that. And a huge part of it is also about letting go of the guilt that comes with leaning on your friends and embracing a non-transactional understanding of relationship work. A couple of other reasons are accessibility. I can't type an essay at this moment. I kind of used up all of my hand strength typing this slide presentation, so I was not about to write an essay. And I also really wanted to be able to share all of this work outside of academic spaces, which is why I ended up doing a YouTube channel and why I did this workshop and opened it to people who don't just go to Davidson, because I'm really interested, and I think it's really important to make work accessible outside of academic institutions.